My name is Talia, and I'm 26 years old. I can still picture the moment when things in my family quietly started falling apart just a few days before Thanksgiving. It began with a phone call from my mom, but something about her voice felt distant and unusually cold, the kind people use when they've already made up their mind about something difficult. I was standing in my apartment kitchen at the time, looking over a grocery list I had started for the trip home, when she said the words that made my stomach sink. She told me I wouldn't be coming to Thanksgiving this year because my sister's new husband thought my presence might make things uncomfortable. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. I asked what she meant, but she just sighed like the conversation was already exhausting. She explained that Ethan, my sister's new husband, felt uneasy around me, and since this would be his first Thanksgiving with the family, they didn't want any tension. I was stunned because I barely knew him at all. We had only met twice, once during their quick wedding dinner and another time at a short family brunch where he hardly spoke to me. Yet somehow I had already been labeled as the problem. I stood there holding my phone while my mom calmly continued, speaking as if it were perfectly normal to leave your own daughter out of a family holiday. She insisted it would probably only be for this year and that maybe next year things would feel different. What hurt most wasn't even the explanation itself, but how easily everyone seemed to go along with it. My sister never called me about it, and my dad didn't reach out either. It felt like they had all quietly agreed that I no longer had a place at the table. That old familiar feeling came back, the one I had known since I was younger, where I somehow ended up feeling like the outsider in my own family. I thought about arguing or asking exactly what Ethan had said about me, but deep down I knew how those conversations usually ended. If I pushed back, they would probably say I was only proving his point. So instead, I surprised even myself. I stayed calm, told my mom I understood, and ended the call. Later that night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by silence. Outside the window, the city was glowing with early holiday lights, but inside I felt empty and unsettled. The words kept repeating in my head, "You won't be at Thanksgiving this year." It sounded less like a request and more like a final decision. After a while, the sadness slowly turned into frustration. I kept asking myself who Ethan was to decide whether I belonged with my own family and why everyone else was letting him make that call. I started thinking back to the few times I had met him. At the wedding dinner, he had looked at me oddly when I mentioned my job, almost like the information had surprised him. Then at the brunch, he had asked several careful questions about my work, my office, and the position I held, as if he was quietly trying to understand something about me. At the time I didn't think much of it, but now those moments began to feel a little more significant than I had realized. The questions he asked that day felt strange, less like friendly curiosity and more like he was quietly trying to confirm something about me. At the time I dismissed it as awkward conversation, but later that night, lying awake in the dark, I began replaying the moment in my mind. I wondered if there had been something else in his expression, something close to recognition or even fear. Still, the more I thought about it, the less it seemed to make sense. I hadn't done anything to this man, and I barely knew him well enough to create any real tension. By midnight, I forced myself to let it go. If my family didn't want me there for Thanksgiving, then so be it. I decided I would make my own plans, cook a simple meal, maybe watch a few movies, or even take a quiet trip somewhere peaceful. I kept telling myself I was fine with the situation, but deep down the rejection still hurt in a quiet, lingering way. The next morning, I went to work determined to push the entire situation out of my mind. My office building downtown was already busy when I arrived, filled with the usual morning rush of people, ringing phones, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the halls. Work had always been the place where life felt stable and predictable, and I valued that sense of order. I liked being someone others depended on instead of someone who felt pushed aside. I had just settled at my desk and opened my laptop when my assistant gently knocked on my door. She looked slightly confused as she stepped inside. "Talia," she said carefully, "there's a man in reception asking to see you. He says it's urgent." I frowned immediately because I wasn't expecting any meetings that morning. "Did he give a name?" I asked. She nodded slowly and said, "Ethan." My stomach tightened the moment I heard it. What was my sister's husband doing here at my workplace? For a second I worried that something had happened to my sister or my parents, but my assistant didn't seem alarmed, just uncertain. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked toward reception while questions raced through my mind. When I turned the corner and saw him standing there, he looked completely different from the calm, polite man I remembered from the wedding. He looked tense and unsettled. The moment his eyes landed on me, his face lost all color, as if he had seen something he never expected. For a brief moment neither of us moved, and the room grew strangely quiet. Then suddenly his chair scraped loudly against the floor as he jumped to his feet, staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. People nearby began turning their heads, confused by the sudden noise. Right there in the middle of my office reception area, with employees and visitors watching in surprise, he began raising his voice in panic. He looked at me like he had just stepped into a situation he never imagined facing. "No, no, this can't be right," he muttered first, shaking his head repeatedly as though trying to convince himself that what he was seeing wasn't real. When I moved a little closer, feeling confused and wanting to understand what was going on, his fear only seemed to increase. You work here?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking slightly. I frowned and answered, "Yes, I do. Why are you here?" My assistant, the receptionist, and a few employees nearby were watching us carefully, clearly sensing that something unusual was happening. Ethan's eyes moved around the lobby again, noticing the company logo on the wall, the staff badges, and the people quietly observing the conversation. His breathing became faster, and then he spoke in a low, almost frightened whisper. "You're Talia. Talia Morgan, the compliance director." I nodded. "Yes, that's me." As soon as I confirmed it, all the color drained from his face. His hands started trembling so badly that he had to hold the back of a nearby chair for support. Then he said something that suddenly explained everything. "Oh God, your sister didn't know." At that moment I was no longer confused. I was simply annoyed. "Didn't know what?" I asked sharply. Ethan swallowed hard and said, "She didn't know you were the one investigating my company." The room suddenly felt much heavier and quieter. I stood there for a moment, thinking through what he had just said, because it was true. I was leading an internal compliance investigation into a medium-sized financial consulting business that was suspected of submitting false reports. The case had been developing quietly for months, and I had never heard Ethan speak in detail about where he worked. At the wedding dinner, he had only mentioned that he worked in financial consulting, nothing more. Now everything started to connect in my mind, the strange way he had looked at me, the careful questions about my job, and the tension whenever we interacted. Ethan ran his hands through his hair in panic and said quickly, "When I saw your name on the wedding guest list, I thought it was just a coincidence. But then I saw you again at brunch and started worrying. I asked your sister about your job, and she said you worked in corporate compliance, but she didn't know the details. I was afraid that if you spent too much time around the family, you might figure out where I worked." I folded my arms slowly and let him continue speaking. "So you told my family I should be excluded from Thanksgiving because I would ruin the atmosphere?" I asked. He looked embarrassed but nodded. "I just needed distance. If you started asking the right questions or connected my company name to your work, I could lose everything." The situation felt almost unbelievable. My own family had chosen to leave me out of Thanksgiving because my sister's husband was worried I might uncover something illegal connected to him by chance. But Ethan did not yet understand the part that truly frightened him. I looked straight at him and said calmly, "Ethan, the investigation already found those connections last week." The blood drained from his face. "What?" he whispered. "Your company name appeared in a financial audit review. We have already obtained the relevant records." He looked completely shaken, as if the floor had suddenly vanished beneath him. His voice dropped to a desperate whisper as the weight of the realization hit him. "You're going to report it," he said, his voice tight with panic. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I just studied him, the man who had convinced my own family to exclude me from Thanksgiving to protect himself, the man who thought keeping me away could somehow hide the truth. After a moment, I finally spoke, my tone calm and steady. That depends on what the records show, I said. But I suggest you start preparing for some very serious questions. Ethan's posture faltered, his confident facade crumbling. He looked less like the new husband my family had welcomed and more like someone who suddenly understood that the consequences of his choices were already closing in. He had come to my office hoping to confirm his fear, and instead, he had walked straight into the confirmation he dreaded most. After a long, tense silence, he gave a weak nod, muttered a quiet apology, and left the lobby, moving as if he were walking toward a storm he could not avoid. Once the doors closed behind him, my assistant turned toward me, eyes wide. "Do I even want to know what that was about?" she asked. I let out a slow breath and shook my head with a faint smile. "Not today," I said. But that evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I reflected on the strange twist of fate. My family had believed I was the one who would ruin Thanksgiving. In reality, the only reason Ethan had been afraid of me was because he already knew the truth about what he had done. And, as always, the truth has a way of appearing exactly where people least expect it.